8 candidates have now thrown their hats in the ring to replace Jason Kenney as Premier of Alberta. They include former Alberta government ministers Travis Taves, Rebecca Schultz, and Rajan Sani, also former Wildrose Party leaders Brian Jean and Daniel Smith. To discuss the race and who may be the front-runner to succeed Premier Jason Kenney is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining us from Edmonton. Tyler, there are rumors running rampant that Conservative MP Michelle Rempel and Independent MLA Drew Barnes may also take a crack at the UCP leadership as well.
Yeah, the main takeaway at this point, I think, is that it's a really, really crowded field. There's reason to think it'll thin out in the next little while, but a lot of pretty high-powered candidates who are involved. Brian Jean, been a very consistent critic of the United Conservative government over the past year or two, who's obviously trying to make a comeback. So, I think you could probably place him in the front runner position at the moment. And the other person probably in that position would be Travis Taves, the finance minister, who has a lot of support from sort of people who are mad at Jason Kenney for breaking grassroots promises, as opposed to the people who are mad at Jason Kenney over some of the COVID mandates. So I think I'd probably place them in the sort of two front-runner positions, if there are front-runner positions at this point, because it's very early days, but it's going to be a crowded field. And I think, I talked to a lot of people in the last month or so who said, this is a challenging time for the party, but it's also a really exciting time for the party. You get to see competing visions of what it should be, to fire up the grassroots, fire up the base, talk about politics and policy and all that kind of stuff. So it's going to be an interesting few months here until we decide, or until we see who the next leader is.
What I find really interesting as well is Calgary Tory MP Michelle Rempel potentially looking at it. What do we know at this point?
Yeah, mostly just rumor as far as I've heard at this point. I know reporters are chasing her, trying to find out for sure whether or not that's a move she's going to make. Obviously, she's in a bit of a strange position at the moment because she was working on Patrick Brown's leadership campaign for the federal Conservative Party. And if Pierre Poilievre wins that race, you have to wonder what her career maybe looks like in the federal Conservatives at that point. So, maybe this is a good time for her to make an exit and move on to provincial politics or something like that. But as I said, crowded field, and I think she would have, say, a challenging time maybe inserting herself in that field, even though I think she would have a lot of the name recognition and things like that could go a long way, particularly with less sort of long time actively involved grassroots sort of UCP members.
So when will the party be choosing its new leader?
Yeah, it'll be October 6th. They announced that this week. So what is that, 3 months, 4 months away, give or take? The notable thing there, of course, is there's an election coming up. So that'll give them a reasonable amount of time anyways to put this person in the driver's seat and give them time to figure it out and build their own brand and all that sort of stuff that needs to be done before the election.
And it's quite the process in running to become the leader of the United Conservatives of a party, period. You need deep pockets and a lot of support. I mean, the registration fee is, what, $150,000? Is that not double what Kenney paid a few years ago?
Yeah, it is. He paid $75,000 was sort of the entry fee, shall we say, at that point. And on top of that $150,000, there's another $25,000 that's sort of a deposit that I guess is to sort of guarantee good behavior in the race, which is, it says something about politics maybe if that's where it needs to go. So yeah, I mean, that's a lot of money that people need to come up with. So you look at that slew of candidates and some of the independents who might be running. There's a small town mayor who's going to be running, and you have to wonder whether or not they can come up with that sort of cash in the next little while here. And there's also signatures. You need, I think, 2,000 or 1,000 signatures from around the province, and you need 200 from each of sort of the 5 zones in the province. So, you can't just sign up everybody in downtown Calgary and hope for the best. You do need to hit the road a little bit to get some of these signatures. So a lot of entry barriers, shall we say, maybe to get into this race. And it's obviously a crowded field even with that. So, I think I mentioned earlier that we might see sort of a natural thinning of this herd a little bit. And I think probably some of these requirements will knock at least a couple people out of this race in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, maybe this is the way the party decides to, kind of determine who the pretenders are versus the contenders. People are really serious and put their money where their mouth is. Now, since Jason Kenney announced that he's stepping down as leader of the UCP, the party's fortunes have actually turned a little bit in the latest polls. According to Legislature, Albertans are more likely to support the party under a new leader.
Well, yeah, I think everyone kind of expected that the United Conservatives would get a little bit of a bump in the polls after Jason Kenney because he was personally, tremendously unpopular. But the bump actually looks pretty good and is sort of moving the United Conservatives back into sort of majority government territory. Obviously, that could change. I mean, who knows? Maybe everyone will hate the next leader or whatever. But for the time being, it looks pretty good. Their number went from 35% of decided voters were going to cast a ballot for the NDP, or sorry, for the UCP. And that went up to, I think, 42%, whereas the NDP is around 40%. So a bit of a shift in the numbers there. I think we'll all be watching those pretty closely in the weeks and months ahead to see where they move, because going to that election, the question was a little bit, was Jason Kenney going to wear a lot of the bad decisions that people felt were bad decisions, or was the party going to wear those decisions? And so with Jason Kenney gone, what's the NDP strategy? Who can they blame? Can they blame Brian Jean if he's the next leader, because he wasn't in government when these things happened? So, I think tactically for the NDP, they have to be looking at this with a little bit of concern, maybe, with an election less than a year out.
Now, speaking of the NDP, they're dealing with a little bit of controversy right now of bullying. Now, a recent story by the Canadian Press says elite staffers have been disrespecting volunteers, some of the grassroots members, and constituency association presidents. Tyler, where have we heard this before?
I know, it feels like we just went through this a couple months ago with the United Conservatives. Sounds like the exact same sort of thing, centralized sort of party power dictating to the grassroots members, which it's a much bigger problem, I think, probably in Canadian politics across the entire board. But it does show that there's a little bit of drama within the NDP. And the reason that that's sort of important is because the NDP has portrayed itself as being, a very tight ship, very well captained, no drama, government in waiting. Not dealing with infighting like the United Conservatives have been for the past couple of years. This shows that the ship maybe has a couple leaks in it, and we're not talking mass revolt like we were with the UCP, but there is a whiff of scandal here, and there's been demands for an investigation into it to see what's going on. So something else to keep an eye on, I think, because as I said, election in less than a year, and every single one of these sorts of stories matters, I think, to parties when a vote's coming up.
If this actually blows up into something even bigger, do you think this could potentially lead to Rachel Notley resigning as leader of the NDP?
I have a hard time imagining they will dump Rachel Notley before the next election. I think she's done a pretty good job. I think most everyone in the NDP thinks she's done a good job. There isn't an obvious person to step in immediately and fill those shoes, I don't think. So I wouldn't say it's not possible. Anything's possible in politics, especially in Alberta politics. But I just can't see that happening, I don't think, unless it gets really, really, really bad.
Tyler, it's not just the UCP which is getting a new leader, but the Alberta Liberal Party is as well.
Yeah, who knew? They're going to have a leadership vote in September, I think it is. The interim leader's been in since last March, and he's going to be stepping down. So they're going to be looking for someone new. Who's going to want to fill those shoes? I have no idea. It's strange to think that a decade ago, the Alberta Liberal Party was, a somewhat influential political party, and haven't had a seat in the legislature in some time. So who knows? Maybe this election, maybe there's some space in the middle of Alberta politics right now for the Alberta Liberals to make a bit of a comeback. So, I think it's worth keeping an eye on some of those smaller parties.
Tyler, let's chat a bit about Bill 17, which recently passed at the legislature. It updated some labor law provisions. Can you talk about its true significance?
Well, it doesn't seem to have gotten all that much attention, but the big thing that this did was created bereavement leave for people whose pregnancy ends in something other than a live birth. So the case of a miscarriage, stillbirth, or abortion, perhaps, they can get paid time off work for bereavement. And this is, I think a small but significant sort of legislative development, because I think at this point we all know someone who's gone through one of those experiences, and it's tough and it's hard, and to be able to take a few paid days off work to grieve that and to sort of deal with what comes next, I think is probably the sort of change that's really going to affect a lot of people. So as I say, it hasn't got a whole ton of notice, and of course it is sort of a labor law sort of provision. You see the sort of the title of it and go, labor law update or whatever. But it is the sort of small government change that actually is going to affect the lives of a lot of people, I think.
The province announced that it's moving on to stage 3 of lifting restrictions, including no more face mask wearing on public transit, and self-isolation will become more of a recommendation as opposed to mandatory. Tyler, the news about the restrictions being lifted was met with mixed reviews?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, some doctors are not very happy about this. They're pointing to the hospitalization numbers. There's still about 880, somewhere in that range, people in hospitals, and about 25-ish, I think, in intensive care. So, they're pointing to those numbers, saying that COVID isn't over yet. Maybe it's a bit premature to drop some of those things. The big one that people probably noticed was the mask wearing on public transit, and Jason Kenney had, when that was kept in, and said, look, there are lots of vulnerable people who have no other way of getting around, so we might as well keep masks in on public transit. A little bit hard to say what has changed so dramatically to see why that has changed, but and then of course people are not super happy about some people, I should say, are not super happy about changing isolation to a recommendation. But this is part of the government's strategy. It's sort of narrative that we have to learn to live with COVID and move on from COVID and things like that. So that's where we're going to be at for the summer. Of course, the federal chief medical officer of health, Theresa Tam, saying that there could be a 7th wave come the fall. So I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll be right back into it in 3 months' time.
And then an 8th wave, a 9th wave, and then
Yeah,
monkeypox.
exactly.
We can't forget about monkeypox.
Right,
So,
of course.
right. Now, Tyler, government officials here in the province are not happy. They're upset that Ottawa's looking at having producers put a potential warning label on ground beef, pork, veal, and lamb. Now, the label from Health Canada would warn that food contains more than, 15% of daily fat, sodium, sugar, or saturated fat?
Right. And so obviously with ground meat, I believe it is the fat that is at issue here. If the label comes in, this could lead to some sort of changes in the grocery store, as grocery stores don't want to have warning label food on their shelves. So more lean meats might be what you're seeing on shelves. But the Alberta government has hit back on this, saying that it's sort of a ludicrous proposal, that this sort of thing is supposed to be for processed food, not whole foods that are just meats or whatever. And of course, so they want an exemption for it, and so do some of the producers, because there are exemptions for other things. There's exemptions for dairy and eggs, for example, which are also kind of high in fat. So a little bit of a double standard thing going on there, maybe. It's just an easy political win for the Alberta government and for the Saskatchewan government too, that is sort of getting in on this. Very easy political win to fight back against warning labels on meat that is part of the 2nd largest industry in the province. So, I think we'll probably hear more about that in the days ahead. And honestly, wouldn't totally surprise me if we saw the federal government back down a little bit on that.
My mother always used to tell me, eat the animal fat too, son. Not only is it tasty, but it's good for your body. So the Ottawa's trying to tell me that my mama's wrong? I don't think so. Mama's never wrong here. Come on. Now, the UCP is still pushing towards replacing the RCMP with a provincial police force, Tyler. Justice Minister Tyler Shandro says an Alberta police force would be more accountable and responsive to policing more in the rural areas.
So this actually, I have to admit, surprised me a little bit, because a couple months ago, maybe a month ago, the rural municipalities of Alberta basically said they didn't like this idea, that they didn't want an Alberta provincial police force. They liked the RCMP and didn't want the uncertainty of it. And then Tyler Shandro, writing in the Red Deer Advocate local paper, saying that the problem is that the RCMP is centralized in Ottawa. It's bureaucratic, it's unaccountable, it isn't policing the priorities that Albertans have, and so we should create our own police force. The history on this is a bit long. Of course, this was part of the Fair Deal panel. There was a big report that came out several months ago into the possibility of an Alberta provincial police. But, it seemed to die down a little bit. And then with the rural municipalities saying they didn't like it, I admit I'd kind of wondered whether or not this was still sort of a front burner issue for the government. And obviously it'll be, if this is going to be a thing, it'll be in sort of the next election campaign platform. But this is a sign, I guess, is the point, that this is still on the agenda, that this is still something that the UCP is considering.
Legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.